Hello and welcome to our Final Voices lecture series. I am Deneen Wada, the Assistant Director at Gallery 400. I'm glad to see you all for this final installment of our 2023 lecture series, Voices lecture series. It's a pleasure to host Salomé Voegelin this evening for a lecture on her practice as an artist researcher who centers on sound and curation. Salomé defines curation as understood at once in relation to its paradoxical providence and care and coloniality. Oh shoot, I can't say that name. As well as in relation to organization and the legitimization of knowledge. Tonight, Salomé discusses her multidisciplinary practice alongside her newly published book, Uncurating Sound, Knowledge with Voice and Hands, which was published by Bloomsbury in February 2023. And our program today is made possible by the UIC School of Art and Art History. For over 25 years, the Voices lecture series has featured timely ideas and significant artists, critics, writers, designers, curators, and historians who engage audiences in their creative and conceptual processes. Lecturers are nominated by UIC faculty and staff and often conduct studio visits with MFA students during their visits, which Salomé will do here at the university and also at SAIC. Following tonight's presentation, you're welcome to engage with Salomé during a Q&A session. And as we settle in, I want to offer a few access invitations. Please do what you need to do to be comfortable in this space. You're welcome to have your camera on or off. Even if your camera is on, feel free to join from a comfy spot, have something to eat, move around, leave, and come back, whatever you need to do to be comfortable. We also have closed captioning available today. You can access them by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom and selecting show subtitles. This is also where you can turn them off if you want. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the relationship to the land we are on today. The broader city of Chicago, named after the Algonquin name for the river whose shores were lined with wild leeks, was and continues to be an indigenous place. Owing to the multiple waterways that converge here, Chicago is the ancestral home of the Three Fires Council, consisting of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, in addition to Miami, Illinois, Inoka, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. The American Indian Center in Albany Park, founded in 1953, in the era of relocation, remains to be the oldest urban Indian center in the country. I hope to not merely acknowledge the land we are upon as a performative gesture, but also invite us to call into relation these lands, histories, and nations. They have not ceased to exist. I also acknowledge the significant work Gallery 400 and UIC have yet to do in honoring these relations and rectifying this colonial presence with other struggles. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us, those native to this land, indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who've come here by force or otherwise, as a result of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and ongoing wars. When entering any space, even virtual spaces, we must bring these histories into view, and with this acknowledgement, we meet here in hopes of making a different world. About our speaker this evening, Salomé Voegelin is an artist, writer, and researcher engaged in listening as a socio-political practice. She writes essays and text scores for performances and publications. Her books include Sonic Possible Worlds, published between 2014 and 2021, The Political Possibility of Sound, 2018, Listening to Noise and Silence, 2010. And her new book is Uncurating Sound, Knowledge with Voice and Hands, which was published in February by Bloomsbury. The book moves curation through the double negative of not to uncuration, untethering knowledge from the expectations of reference and a canonical frame, and reconsidering art as political in its message or aim, but by way it confronts the institution. Voegelin's practice engages in participatory, collective, and communal approaches. Between 2014 and up to the COVID pandemic in 2020, she co-convened with Mark Peter Wright the regular cross-disciplinary listening and sound-making event, Points of Listening. And since 2008, she has collaborated with David Molen plus Voegelin in a practice that reconsiders sociopolitical, architectural, and aesthetic actualities and sites from the blind spots of a leaky vision and the possibility of sound, things, voices, and text. Voegelin is a professor of sound at the London College of Communication at the University of the Arts in London. She is the principal investigator on the UK Research Council founded project, the Sounding Knowledge Network. Please welcome her with a warm round of applause.
Hi everybody, and thank you so much, Fidelia Mara, for inviting me, and for Gallery 400 for giving me this opportunity to meet you all online. It's a weird flashback being back online again after sort of a foray into real presentation and real being with people. But obviously there are many benefits of being able to speak with you now as you're in Chicago and I'm in Berlin, and it's much more ecological this way, that's for one, and it's also much, of course, more economical and much easier to do it that way. I hope you can all hear me okay, and this kind of form of being together that we've all been practicing over the past 2 years, 3 years, etc. We were still used to it, even if we do not maybe entirely like it, or it is restrictive. It has certain restrictions, but I'm just very pleased to be with you. I have once been to Chicago and really loved it. I love the lake. I'm really envious of having that huge lake, and it was in November, so it was very cold. And as we've just discussed, that is actually very beautiful. I like that brisk blue skied cold that I experienced when I was there. I decided that tonight I'm not going to show slides, and I sort of felt nicer to just talk, to just have that connection, which is hard enough to have that online. I will play some sounds and I will read from the new book, and I will show you things. I actually have brought things along to show you, actual objects that I will show and describe. But I was also very inspired by this idea of not having slide at a recent conference that I was at the Wellcome Trust in London. And that conference was about Beyond the Visual. It was organized by Kenneth Wilder and Aaron McPeak. And it was all about what blindness brings to art. So not seeing blindness as a negative, as a disability, but actually as an other ability, also as a gain, as something else to have. And it was a whole discussion of how a blind sensibility, what it brought to art. And one of the curators who was speaking there, and I'm so sorry that I forgot the name, but she very aptly remarked that slides were for visually dependent people. And I really liked that turnaround and that sleight of hand of not suggesting that there was anything missing in people who couldn't see, but rather that people who could see were too dependent maybe on their vision. It was really, they're hanging their whole knowledge and their whole orientation on vision, and losing out on all the other ways and means by which we can explore and know the world and ourselves in that world. So in that spirit, I also will not show slides. when I show slides tonight. And I also think for me, it is 12 o'clock at night. So given the hour, it feels a little bit like a late night radio broadcast, and it will probably be mellower than a day talk. So I think you could also just listen and don't look at all, and just follow the descriptions when I show one of the objects I've brought along. It can't just be a mellow voice that guides you through at least my night and your late afternoon, because I certainly am more tired than I would be in the morning. So it's a weird shift in time that also brings a different shift in tone and pace of my voice and my ideas, I'm sure. I want to start the talk, or rather, we are again in this room that we've been in over the last 2-3 years, due to COVID, as a kind of viral condition that we lived through. And I think that we're still sort of living through. Apparently there's a new burst coming, and will we ever be pandemic free? And what does it tell us about the way we live on the world is very interesting to me, because I feel we're often discussing like, when is the next vaccine here and how can we protect ourselves? But we've actually spent very little time discussing as to why these pandemics happen and reoccur, and maybe the relationship between these pandemics and ecological shifts, climate change, the climate emergency, the change in temperature, and cultural values that we have, and the way we travel, the way we live, the animal husbandry, and so on, which hasn't been discussed very much. But I think what we've lived through is this viral condition. And in this viral condition, I also wrote the book that I want to talk about. So I brought it along, Uncurating Sound, Knowledge with Voice and Hands. It's a slightly smaller book than other books I've written, in terms of it's literally just the size of my hand, so it's smaller in size, and it is also slightly thinner. But I felt it was very important to write it as a book that you could always put to your pocket, that you could literally sort of carry around with you, that didn't need much space in a bookshelf. It is grayish, whitish tones of at the front, and the yellow writing, Uncurating Sound. And I've written the book very much during this pandemic, so it necessarily reflects on that condition. It reflects on the condition of isolation, of being in quarantine. I was in England at the time, so 6 months we spent locked away. We were only allowed out 20 minutes a day, unless you had a dog, when you could go out a few more times a day. And it was very controlled. And I think that brought a very intense form of writing, and a very intense idea of what writing can be, and how we can relate to each other when we write a book. Because one of the things I certainly learned while writing is that to write a book, you need friends, you need conversations, you need to be in conversation with. It is very much, although it seems an isolated pursuit, an isolating and solitary pursuit, but actually it is also a pursuit that very much depends on conversation, and not being in conversation, not being able to go to talks, hear other people speak, ask them questions, had a real impact on how I could imagine writing and how I could imagine this book. So it's a small book of 5 chapters, if I can call them chapter, because I didn't call them chapter, I called them breath. There are 4 breaths in this book, and there is a performance score in this book. That is somewhere about curating and uncurating, but it is very much also about politics and about violence. Curating as a foil, maybe to a certain degree, about organization and how we organized also politically, how the aesthetic organizes us politically, or maybe reveals how we organized politically, how we organized into habits and norms that are quite perfidious in the way that they appear so naturalized and normalized in everything they hide. And curation obviously also has a direct link to colonialism, quite literally to a whitewashing of money made and lives lost through colonial times, and persistent now in a present scenario with high finance and oil that is to a large degree financing galleries and museums, and therefore curation, and what is taste and class that is also somewhere involved in the efforts of taste. So I feel this this condition of isolation maybe has made this book a slightly more, a book more based on ressentiment, on resentments, on angers that maybe the other books weren't, a crystallization of what is wrong in the world and a real need to write about it and to think about it and to listen to it also in the close proximity of my home in where I am. And for me, the viral is the contemporary. At the moment, I think this is how I can think the contemporary as a viral condition, as a condition that reveals to us our relationality, our porosity, our vulnerability, and our openness to each other, a kind of indivisibility, that we really made all of the same stuff, of the same breath, of the same air we breathe, as a real new insight that has come to us all through the pandemic of a very different image than the visual image, very individuated, very separated bodies that have sovereignty, which was, for living in England, a very big word over the last 5-6 years, this fight for sovereignty. Nobody could actually articulate it. And it turns out COVID showed us that sovereignty really is a false promise, because we're not autonomous in an individuated sense. We're very interdependent, we're very entangled. Our porosity, our contagiousness shows us that that we sort of belong together, and therefore also demands of us a certain responsibility. And of course, it's very alarming. The pandemic is alarming, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. And I also don't think it was as a symmetrical thing, because dependent on the job you have, your previous medical condition, whether you have any underlying conditions, and whether you had a good health insurance or not, whether you had a good hospital near, or whether you could afford to stop your job for a while, you experienced COVID, I'm sure, very, very differently. So I'm not saying that it is a leveler. I'm not saying it brought out parity, not at all. But I think it has brought out something that was hidden in a visual paradigm, which is our relationality and how we are reliant on each other, how we're codependent. And I felt that was a very important insight that's guided this book, and that's guided my thinking about sound. So I want to start very briefly. I work a lot with text scores, and I'm very pleased that Hannah is here to listen, because I am obviously a very great fan of Fluxus text scores, and particularly of Alison Knowles' various very kind of simple but extremely powerful text scores, and text scores as a means to battle, certainly in a musical discourse, with this the exclusions of virtuosity, the exclusions of, oh, you have to do the right kind of music, and you have to be able to read a score as in a partitur, as in notes. You have to know what certain things are, otherwise you're not admitted to this group of people who can do these things. And on the other hand, to me, they bring also in something very domestic, and every day is brought into our discourse through them. And in a way, yes, of course, there always are still limits, but you have to be able to, I guess, speak, but in whatever language you want to. But text scores are really available to, I guess, to most of us. So I wrote a lot of text scores, and particularly during the pandemic, they became very important to me. So I know we're not meeting in a room, we're all separate in our little cells that I can see here on my Zoom image. And this is a text score really written for the first few meetings after coming out of isolation, of meeting people again, and having talks and participatory events with people in a room, sometimes still with masks on and sometimes with no masks anymore. And there was this tension of breathing together, that we breathe the same air, and becoming very aware of that. So this text score is called Breathing. Breathe normally. Listen to your breath, in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. Stop breathing. And now we're sort of globally still sharing the same air, even though we're in different locations and in our different Zoom bubbles. But of course, that kind of anxiety of sharing air with a person sitting next to you, when you've just spent 2.5 years not breathing with other people, is somewhat gone, has somewhat dissipated. We are safe in our Zoom bubbles. And that is what is so fascinating about COVID. Our whole idea of science and of knowledge since Enlightenment is based on the idea of distance and objectivity and separateness, and a body that stops at the skin, where we end here, and are separated from each other and therefore measurable, quantifiable. And a lot of feminist discourse, of course, people like Elizabeth Gross and so on, have for a long time, since the 60s and 70s, told us how porous we are and how leaky we are and how we are not these sealed off individuated bodies. But it is one thing to read about it and another to then experience it in COVID. And I think that's the sort of strength of COVID, because the whole fact that we had to be behind walls and windows and that we had to wear masks kind of shows the deceit of that idea of knowledge and that idea of objectivity, that is really a falsehood, an invention, something that isn't true, and that maybe this porosity would be a better way to start to understand and to make sense of how we live together, and that we are not beings but beings with, and that we can really experience these ideas that have been worked out through new materialism for quite some time now, but I feel COVID has made us sense them. And so in this time of COVID, I did a lot of I wrote more scores maybe than normal, because it kind of was an invitation. It was an invitation to write more scores, because what else could you do behind closed doors? And a lot of discourse performed, if you will, the house, the space, the limits of the space I was in. So this is another one. Lick score. Stand in front of a window, preferably one overlooking a busy street. Start cleaning the window with your tongue, making loud, sloshing sounds. And that kind of anxiety of our saliva and our spit, with which we couldn't, in COVID, confront each other. We couldn't kiss, we couldn't get close, we couldn't hug. So I had to lick a window, I had to lick the membrane that was between me and the people passing down below. I'm just reading on a little bit in the book from where I go from that score. After licking windows, knocking on walls, walking in woods and leaning into the digital on a precarious Ethernet line suspended outside, and after moving to another country, and finally hearing people again, sharing a room and being in conversation, I now really aim to write this small volume in the form of chapters and performance scores. These are texts and textual rhythms to try to uncurate sound and uncurate knowledge with ears and hands and an idiosyncratic voice, to ponder the normal through the notion of post-normality as a different aspiration, not to go back, but to go forward into another possibility, to imagine how things could be after the experience of the pandemic, understood as the consequence of the celebration of toxic normativity. How we could care for each other and how we could understand where knowledge connects on open skins, to make a plural field of the local, the feminist, the decolonial and the tacit, and to reveal the universalizing violence of science and art. So it was that kind of finding that inspiration, because I had been quite procrastinating on writing this book, and it was meant to be a completely different book. And to kind of finally feel, no, it had to be written, because there was something in that experience. And obviously in that experience of COVID, in this viral contemporary and in this licking of windows and that sloshing of that sound, there was for me the clarity that that we sound through a sonic thinking, and if we could practice that, if we could continue to practice that, we didn't have to go back to normality, but actually sound could keep that consciousness and keep that sensibility and help us to this paradigm shift where maybe this responsible, interwoven, entangled and being with could find a future on sound. Because of course, the desire that all of us had was very much to go back to go back to normal, to as quick as possible, be able to take off masks. At least governments were very much like that. Every government wanted to be the quickest to be out of this, to show its citizens that no, we are the best government, vote for us because we got you out of this dilemma, out of this pandemic. But it was just this sense, we just have to go back to normal and everything will be fine, rather than seeing, well, what is this normality? What actually did this normality mean? And isn't this a chance to maybe rethink what the normal is and where we could go from here and how we could rethink it? So now at the very end of the book, I end on a plaidoyer for the post-normal, a post-normal that has no dash between post and normal, but that really experiences the post as a form where the past and the present meets and understands that it has to make a different future, a responsible future. Extreme events are a catalyst for a different thinking and talking, and sometimes render it impossible to speak at all, fostering the need to defy the language from before and triggering the search for another one, a defiant muteness, and then new utterances, gesture words, noises, screams, realizing that all that is connected to normative language has to go, even if that means tending towards madness and inarticulation, embracing ruptures and alien voices, and letting the small breath we take before speaking linger in silence to find a different voice and a different way to articulate. How do you go back to trusted norms and organization when their value has just exposed the perfidy of its comforts? The desire for norms is born of a lack of imagination, of different socio-political possibilities, and of defeat. It represents the sentimentality and longing for a white patriarchal system associated falsely with the absence of the virus and the absence of war in Europe, when it is itself its breeding ground. A double bind and a trickery of violence and of oppression to call on us to reinstate the order that caused the asymmetries that caused the virus and that caused the war, and that was revealed so starkly under the pretext of a war and virus-free world. In response, and as a radical attempt against the condition of defeatist normativity, against the perceived comfort of snapping back into how it was before, and inspired by the alienation experienced through the pandemic, I hope to imagine an afterwards that as a continued attempt enables a sustainable transformation, because it holds within it the knowledge of its own perfidy and the reality of its consequence. So I was aspiring to a post-normal, and that when you say pronouncing the post-normal aloud forms one word, it meets in one sound, generated from their encounter, the encounter of post and normal, and interbeing as neither post nor normal, but as how they sound together and what they generate in their complex contradiction and uncertainties. So that it is neither normal nor post, but an uncertainty that kind of happens between the two. And for me, that was very much an imagination or a speculation where sound could help us, and the sonic thinking could help us, a sonic thinking that was already viral, or that met the viral, that already lived the viral condition of indivisibility and relationality and contagion and porosity and the uncontainability of the sonic that help us continue the thinking of the pandemic, to help us continue with that knowledge that the insights gained from having to wear masks because we are so proximus, and it is proximity rather than distance that is critical and that is useful to think about art and aesthetic and politics and knowledge. But to sort of maybe, so I have now read to you a piece from the very beginning of the book, and then a piece more towards the end of the book, and I haven't said anything about the in-between. And I sort of maybe want to retrace that journey, or take that as an opportunity to retrace that journey, because what kind of happened with that desire against just accepting the norms and the striving against for norms, and maybe practice some of the elements, some of the things that happened. Because one of the things that happened quite early on with the scores, and some of them, and what the scores I read you, was that being locked away and writing these scores, and a lot of the scores were about walls and how I worked with walls and ceilings and clothes and windows and so on. And after a while, I got in touch with a friend who runs Flaming Pines, that is an album, a record producer, record company, if you will, who do experimental sound and music records. And we discussed the scores and we discussed ideas, and she very kindly sort of said, oh, let's invite artists who are also, you know, kind of in different areas of the world, and that we sort of conceptualized that they would respond to the scores, that they would make a piece of music in response to the score. And we made this album. Paint Your Lips while singing your favorite pop song. I put the Bandcamp link in the chat. I hope this works. Yeah. And it was only limited released as a record, and the rest was on Bandcamp, but it had wonderful artists such as Antigreye, Kamaru, Rodri Davis, Ria Nakajima, Shiva Shamini, Claire Rousset, Arturas Bumsteiners, and Rebecca Lennon. So artists from all over the world, really, who I admired and knew, and who I knew were also in their own lockdown and in their own viral condition, and for whom I then wrote each one of these scores and sent it to them and said, look, just very, you know, no big fuss, no big composition, just improvise with that score a 3 to 5 minute piece, anything you can imagine, and we make it into an album that kind of captured maybe in some ways this spirit. And I want to play, if I have time, maybe I don't have that much time, but I want to play at least one of the pieces on the records. Let's see whether I've got time for both. But I want to play Loving It, by which I had sent to Rodri Davis, who is a Welsh experimental harpist. And his score was, listen to a sound that you like, stay with it, sound it to try to understand your like, continue until you love it. And let me just share. You'll unfortunately have to look at my very messy iTunes as I share this song with you. We couldn't do it another way. So that was loving it, and I sort of realized because of time, maybe I played a sort of the bonbon song, which is Hating It by Claire will say later if I see I have a little bit more time left. I also wrote some liner notes that I think I'm going to read a short bit from, because it sort of feel like it is explain the score writing, in particular in this viral condition. I write scores to get into conversation with human and more than human things while staying by myself. I use words to trigger an exchange that includes, beyond words, the doing, listening and sounding to and with things. My starting point is private and intimate, quiet mainly, if not mute, and felt rather than heard. From there, the speaking of words expands the feeling into doing, which is listening and sounding takes a contingent shape that meets that of others and other things, listening and sounding too. Thus, on the basis of odd and private imaginations, I start to make a shared racket and a space of things that narrate their own instructions. And I think it was that bit, the kind of the ability to narrate instructions that can be obeyed or not, that can lead to completely unforeseeable organizations and shapes and compositions and events, that really interested me. And it particularly interested me in this COVID time, but it also interested me as a curatorial project, as a project of conversation, as making a curatorial project, making an album as a curatorial project where you leave out, yes, you have the institution of the record industry, of course, but you leave out the white space of the museum, you sort of circumnavigate that space, and you can rethink that space a little bit, and its violence, it's architectural, it's historical, it's contemporary violence, and rethink about it. And that was really important to me, or that became a very important aspect of the book, that really has at least 3 of the breaths are very tightly engaged in the curatorial, but the curatorial as a practice of the curator, but also curatorial as a practice of governance and the practice of an aesthetics of organization, and how we live together, and how things are organized, and how we move from how paving slabs are organized, how the urban environment are organized, are all thoughts behind these things. And at this point, of course, I would have loved, if I had been in England this evening, I would have brought in a Tate and Lyle sugar bag. I don't know whether you know them. I'm sure in America too, sugar is sold in paper bags, I presume, and in Germany too. But in England, particularly on the sugar bag, it says Tate and Lyle. And obviously we have the big galleries, Tate Modern and Tate Britain and Tate Liverpool now as well, Tate somewhere else, I think, as well. And of course, Tate and Lyle is the big sugar company, and the first Tate Britain is right in front of the Thames, so you have the Thames running through, and here are big steps going up to a very church-like building in which the Tate company housed its first painting collections, that obviously were its first whitewashing of the very money they made of the sugar that came up the Thames. So there was this very clear lines of connections between the money from the plantations and the money being made, and the art, how it whitewashed it. And to me, that is a very clear, that sugar bag, a very clear image of reminding us of that background and of that history that is still very present, and a real need for art and curation to rethink this, to think about those lines, and to work at least aware of these power lines. So I'm just reading a little bit again from the book about such power lines. Curation's colonial foundation and incredibly purposeful infrastructures houses the apparently purposeless, the playful and the extravagantly unusable, whose resistance to use value and rational sense apparently withdraws it from neoliberal exploitation to express artistic freedom and possibility. It also, however, reveals and plays out the paradox of uncaring and the violence of aesthetic coercion, as the lack of usefulness enables its use within art and determines ours and in its creation and legitimation. The artwork and the curator are dependent on the historical and ideological design of the gallery as architecture and as cultural concept, to legislate the work as piece and to legislate the body of the audience as viewer, in order to give shape and value to a form that resists the same. The purposelessness of art sets out to defy the line of value financed by lines of exploitation, while at the very same time its purposelessness grants opportunity for the performance of social and financial politics, understood as the governance of care and neglect, to frame the possibility of art through the possibility of the political. Thus, the artwork makes a form that remains formless, but forms value and orders validity. And the art world, through its own resistance to use value, becomes the stage for neoliberal exploitation, performed as the continuation of the colonial in the curatorial frame, whose operational structures demand quasi-religious fervor and devotion to bring offerings to the machine of purposeless übervalue, and to instrumentalize human and more than human bodies as bodies of work. Its workers and artists, curators and visitors cannot escape the violent politics of order and organization, and the artwork, whatever its content, will be sublimated into this notion of validity and meaning through an ordering along canonical, geographical, economic, color, gender, and other lines. Therefore, political resistance and ultimately the practice of a different politics, not tied to the colonial structure of the curatorial organization, not tethered to the line, cannot lie only in the content of the work, but in how it responds to the infrastructure of display, how it reimagines the history and ideologies of the curatorial frame, how it deals with its economy, how it engages or not in an ethics of care, and how it enables or not a community of practice that makes its processes visible. And to me, that kind of discussion of lines, and in the book I discuss a lot of lines, becomes very important to think, well, what do we do with these lines? How else can an artwork be performed? How else can we work with the curatorial? I mean, an album is sort of one attempt, and the kind of conversation and communality of sharing scores and of playing scores and of sending them back is one form. But what other resistances can we find? How else can we perform alternatives? Because I don't think this is a critique of saying we shouldn't do art. In fact, I suppose we should all do more art. We should all do a lot more art, but maybe not art that goes into museums. But so in the process of that, I discuss work by Cara Walker and Kathy Acker and Adrian Piper and many other artists who I feel are in one way or another trying to work with this violence, the violence to the bodies and the violence to work and the violence to value and validities. And where I always come back to is spatiality and space. What is the space in which art is being shown? Because the spatiality we have in our mind is always very Cartesian. It comes still from Descartes, it's still drawn with lines, it's measurable. We don't live with the space, we don't live with the world, we live in it, we inhabit it, which suggests it is a kind of a room that exists before we're there and that we can enter, but our entering will not necessarily change that room. Whereas what I felt very much during the pandemic, performing the limited rooms I had, we were a family of 4, and in England, London rooms are, as I'm sure are in Chicago too, flats are very small, so we had 70 square meters, the 4 of us being together every day long. So of course you start to perform these boundaries and these walls and this sense of space very, very much through sound work and writing and just the daily living. And this spatiality as a kind of, to me, made up of lines, and made up of lines we can measure and we can place ourselves in, or we have a sense we can place ourselves in, I think is part, and I'm still working that out, of part of the resistance, that to achieve through the sonic a different spatial imaginary that allows us a very different sense of knowledge, a different sense of how we exist together, how we live together. A spatiality that is not born of this sense of a world we live in, but very much a world we live with other human and more than human beings. That world that I talked about earlier, the world of the lick score, the world of porosity, of being together, where sound really doesn't create a linear space, but creates a voluminous dimensionality in which we exist reciprocally and relationally and together, where things are not this or that, here or there, but it's very much about the spaces in between and the relationships, as my sound is not here on my lips and it's not on your ears really, but it meets somewhere in the middle and it creates this other space between us, even though we are separated online, but still somewhere this space where we meet in conversation is not a metric space, it's not a perspectival space. And I think this working on our spatial imagination through curation, partly through curation, through an artistic knowledge, through art, can be a very important tool. At the same time, of course, also temporality, this rethinking also of temporal lines, of canonical lines, of who do we mention after whom and before, and do we need to follow this chronology, or could we not live in much more fuzzy spaces, which is the performance score that's in the book, is a performance I've done in Sierre in Switzerland, where it was a performance that was a talk, but that performed the talk, and where, while playing different sound works, and in particular a piece by Ellen Fullman, which is about the long string instruments that really brings a room into vibration rather than into its lines. I also was drawing a line and then undrawing a line with chalk on the floor of the stage, trying to get into that fuzzy space of a different spatiality and a different temporality, where the canonical line was not determining my vision, and where a sort of sense of inside and outside wasn't determining my orientation of what could be true. So because I'm sort of realizing we are hurtling towards the end of the hour, but where I got with all of that, and also where I got with the book discussing these various artworks and the problematic between the violence of curation and how we are curated as well when we go to a gallery, how we move along, how we behave, what we expect, our own subjectivities in the gallery space, and bringing that together with the viral condition and understanding of having a sense that sound and the sonic thinking and the sonic doing and listening together could kind of create a paradigm shift where all of this could be revealed, where we could build on our viral experience and competencies that we had sort of learned, and our new sense of self that hopefully we had established during the pandemic, not to hurtle back to the normal, but to kind of embrace in a post-normality a sense of a sonic sensibility as a new sense of how we could experience the world that will carry with it forth all these notions of being within responsibility. And then, of course, my question was, well, how can we keep these competencies alive? How can we sustain them? How can we now go into an age of the sonic, and how can the post-normal carry the sonic sensibility? And I felt that there was also an educational task, there was an advocacy task, there was an educational task to bring it into the curriculum, if you will, bring it into training, because we are all very visually entrained. The moment we go to kindergarten, the moment we go to school, we become very visual beings. Our whole culture is, at least in a US European context, very visually orientated, and ourselves, we are visually orientated. And I talked about masks and walls and the fallacies of that visual. And it is a cultural visuality, because of course we could look at the world completely differently. There's nothing stopping us of seeing relationships and seeing reciprocity, but the way that we are entrained on the measurable, on the metric, on the taxonomical, on the nameable, and on cartographic and perspectival dimensions, rooms and temporalities, I felt like we needed an untraining and a sonic training. And so it's not, I want to stress that it's not about an essentialism. When I talk about sound, it's not about sound against the visual. It's not sound as another exclusionary force, but rather it's sound as a portal into a relationality and in a multisensoriality, and to see more, not to not see, but to see more and to see differently, to see in an embodied and effective and a tacit way, and to bring these senses together. So at the very end of the book, and where I am at the moment with my research and my thinking, also having moved mid-COVID to Germany, a country I'd never lived in, and that has a different relationship and a different history with sound, and also obviously with politics and with all sorts of different things. And I felt this need for an advocacy and a training of sound as part of a curriculum, a strong need for me. And I felt so that I sort of came up with this concept for myself of a transversal sound studies that I'd like to sort of see in every university and every school to be pursued. So practicing a practical theorizing of ears and voice and hands, with the capacity to access relational worlds. And these would be part of every university course you do or every school you go to. It wouldn't just be, oh, here is a little bit of sound studies, but actually that there would be almost, if you will, a sound officer who would be at these places of learning and doing together to emphasize how various subjects could also be approached with sound. And it was very difficult to kind of entice people into that. So my project, and at the moment, is a suitcase. It's a bit difficult to see that, a bit further back. It's quite an old-fashioned suitcase, and as you see, it has various destinations on it for now, where I traveled with it, because I felt, well, if institutions do not want my transversal sound studies, I have to travel. I have to become a traveling saleswoman for a transversal sound studies, and simply bring it to places and persuade people that post-pandemic, this was the way to reimagine education and thinking and knowledge and learning together. And the suitcase, obviously, on the one hand, you can say it's contextualized by the obvious of Marcel Duchamp's Poiton-Valise or by Alexander Calder's Circus, but it's actually also much more contemporary in art by people like Mohammed Hafez and Ahmed Badr and other artists who are using suitcases to comment on migratory issues and the situation of the refugee, which has obviously particularly also through the war in the Ukraine, but also in Syria and all the other pressures of climate and so on, become a much more foregrounded subject. So I sort of feel with the suitcase, I'm also aligning myself somewhere with a nomadic practice of sound that needs to stay nomadic. It's not about situating and claiming a disciplinary territory. It is about interloping, intervening. It's about entering into existing discourses and bringing the invisible and the indivisible to them, so that they can explore, so they're participatory and relational competencies and capacities, and rethink this sense of distance and objectivity as the markers of legitimacy, when we so clearly experienced that they are not, and that in fact they are the markers of a worldview that can colonize, that can capture, that can make maps and grab that territory that has been mapped, that can measure bodies and make an anatomy of bodies in order to name those bodies and identify those bodies within limits that restrict what these bodies can be and what these bodies can relate to and be with. So that is my plan and my hopes and dreams for a post-normal, post-pandemic world. And I think I might just sort of leave it there and maybe enter into a conversation if there are any questions, or if not, of course, we can also listen to another track from the album.
Thank you, Salomé, for that. We're open to questions from the audience. We did receive one from John. John, you can unmute and ask your question if you'd like.
Sure, yes. Thank you very much for your talk. So my question comes from my classical music background. And so when you were talking about improvisation, I was actually having a discussion with another one of my friends that improvisation nowadays, having left the Baroque period, is very much not practiced in classical music. Whereas in the Baroque period, adding your own ornamentations, Mozart's scores are skeletons. You're supposed to add things, and many artists don't do that. They just sing what's on the page and that's it. And so it takes a lot of, I think what you were talking about, a lot of listening to be able to continue the practice of improvisation in a day where what's printed is what is, and to kind of conceptualize how do how do you improvise within these very structured institutions? I would call classical music an institution, really. So I'll ask my question. So can it be argued that regulation breeds freedom? And this question, I guess, comes from the whole idea of when the neoclassicism, you know, the idea that you create your own boundaries in order to have more freedom. And so if we were able to live in the liminality between, you know, structure and no structure, if one doesn't know what to grasp for, if that's so unfamiliar to someone, having no structure or being okay with not having a structure, would ultimately they feel alienated and find that freedom to be even more challenging than when structure's there? And so how do we live, or how do you learn to live in a place where you can let go of structure but not necessarily feel alienated from it, if that makes sense?
It totally makes sense. And I think it's a really good question, because I think it's the question we ultimately have to ask, not only in music, but in every discipline, if we're really serious about feminism and decoloniality, because we cannot pretend that we can keep on to structures of legitimacy and value that are apparently, you know, universalized. And obviously that is a very decided, apparently universalized, and do peer review, or even write PhDs and then value them. You know, it's very, very tricky. Where do we put our value systems? And I do not think that regulation gets you more freedom, because regulation is only still works within the community which has made the regulations or which has decided on the regulation, and it still excludes. It still says, well, these are our regulations. You know, I'm actually, funny enough, a very great fan of serialism. I find it a necessary and emancipatory music at the time that it was conceptualized and practiced. And I mean, I could talk a long time about what a shame that it didn't maybe catch on and did more other things. And I'm not only happy with what John Cage kind of did with it, as it's kind of yeah, but that's a different issue. But I feel there is something very important, because if decoloniality doesn't just mean we add more and plural names to the reading lists, but if it is really also an auto-decoloniality, where we become very aware of our own, how we have been normatized ourselves from day one, how we are, in a sense, brought into a system that we have very little choice over, where values are set that we are entrained in from day one and trained in, and how we can kind of understand the complicity, as me as a white European woman, my complicity in the colonial project, while also, however, of course, experiencing a sense of determination from outside all the time. And how do we negotiate that space? I mean, you call it freedom, and that is such a philosophically difficult word, but how could we let, because it's not just a matter of just pluralizing the institution, but it's really about a greater critique of the institution. How do we learn? How do we teach? Not only what, but also how. And most importantly, how do we value it? You know, how do we mark it? How do we assess it? If we say knowledge is plural, are the ways we can go about doing art, and music is plural, maybe we have to abandon the notion of assessment. Yeah. And the rigor has to lay elsewhere, that the rigor is not anymore in the mapping of my text to a canon or my musical composition to a canon, how it compares with the good and greats that came before it, but that the rigor has to lie on the body, the body composing, the body performing, the body listening in a very contingent engagement with the music. And that might mean I have to listen to it 20 times maybe, because I cannot expect to recognize it if it's plural. If there's a plural knowledge, music, art system, my sense of value cannot come from recognition, because as soon as that comes from recognition, I'm already excluding everything I don't know. And in that sense, I'm already you know, I've already made a value judgment before I even start. So that we have to actually find different ways and constantly different ways of what we say, what is good art, what is good music, and what determines it. And it's interesting what you say about Mozart, or in general about classical music. The idea we now have of classical music that is on these beautiful score sheets, you know, the beautiful partitur that you buy for a lot of money, and you know, and no mark is on it. It's all neatly finished. It's as you say, it's completely not true. These would have been scribbled and written and rewritten. And I even was at this very beautiful performance of Baroque music where the conductor showed us how this would have been at the time, that the conductor would have interrupted if he felt the audience wasn't really listening properly. He would have replayed a certain part of it and brought in a surprising element and rewritten it on the spot, because it was a performance. It was a live performance that could change, that hadn't been distilled into this sense of what we now call classical music. So I think we need to probably resurrect these things and demystify. Music still has a long way to go in sort of getting rid of its weird idea of genius and of what is good music and virtuosity. Because there is violence in curation, there is violence in virtuosity, and the notion of virtuosity that is terribly exclusive. I don't know whether I'm a bit of a pessimist. I don't know whether it will happen.
No, you're in good company. I am too. It's if I may ask a follow-up question, it's I just, as you were speaking, it's really interesting. I don't think we know anymore how to listen, and I say that because you know, I was at a concert yesterday. And, you know, coming from a classical music background, I like to hear the things that make a performance not perfect, because it's nice to realize that these are a whole bunch of individuals who all have parents, who all have come, and, you know, all these different individuals have come. But I don't think a lot of us, certainly I think that people who don't live in this space of constantly hearing, know how to listen to music. I feel like we spend so much time trying to, at least in the musical professional world, we spend so much time trying to perfect ourselves that we kind of forget that we're performing for someone, that this is music for someone, rather than this is just kind of a commodity that we're doing to get paid and then we go home. That we don't really spend a lot of time anymore teaching people how to listen. And so I'm glad that you're taking this to institutions, because I think more students need to be taught not just what the music is, but really how to listen to it. Not from a theoretical place, but from a deeper level. So thank you very much for this and your work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. No more questions? Comments? I mean, I could just play Hating It. Maybe that is maybe that would be a good way to if there are really truly no other questions or comments, or maybe as a warm-up towards further questions, I can play Hating It by Claire Rousset. As I can't see you apart from Erin, it's very hard to say whether that's a good idea. So I'll just do it.
Please do.
So I read the score first, so you know what I gave them. Hating it. Listen to a sound that you like. Stay with it. Sound it to disturb your like. Continue until you hate it. I don't know whether in the meantime any more other questions came up, or that we should just go through all the tracks in the album.
I'm all for a listening session, Salome.
Okay, great. I'll just play from the album until somebody has a question. This is a particular, I mean, I shouldn't say favorite, I love them all, but this is one I really like. It's by Ria Nakajima. She's a Japanese artist who works with, you can see her performances. She's got quite a few videos on YouTube. She has these very funny wind-up toys, little toys that she performs with, small items on the floor. She performs them on the floor, often also in collaboration with other artists. And the score I gave her, because it was rain season in Japan. Listen to the tap, tap, tapping of the rain. Let it drip into your head to make your hands continue it. I cannot see the chat, so I cannot say whether there are any questions, but if there are not, I just continue until somebody stops me. So the track that the record starts off with is by Antje Greyer, an originally East German artist who for many years now has lived on a small island in Finland, very much up in the north. And the score I sent her was: make your hands into a cup shape, place it over your mouth, sing while pressing down as hard as you can. And then maybe as a final track, if I may, is Joseph Camaro's piece, which was a response to a score to start hearing the invisible, which I sort of think is quite a nice way to end, as a kind of this desire to start hearing more, listening more, hearing the invisible via a sort of post-pandemic sensibility. So the score read: sit, stand, or lie down. Press your ear against the nearest surface. Listen to what it sounds like inside. Make that sound.
Well, thank you, Salome, for a beautiful evening. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you are all doing well and keeping warm and enjoying the sunshine. We will join you next fall for our Voices lecture series. Keep in touch with us, sign up for a newsletter, and more soon. I can't tell you who we're expecting in the fall, but it'll be a good lineup of people. But in any case, I hope that you all enjoy your evening and your night. Salome, I hope you have a good night and get some rest. Otherwise, thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you everybody for listening. Bye-bye.